economic growth and development. Okay? This next part when we look at is going to talk about sectionalism. And what that means, even though it sounds funny, basically is different parts of the country split, right? So you have a section here, which ends up being called the what?
Looks like a shoe.
Okay. North, right? And then you have a section here, what ends up being called the
West.
South. Brady, that's enough. Okay, now during the war, you have all of these states. Okay, what do they end up being called? Border states. Okay, border states. So when we talk about sectionalism, it's talking about basically north and south. Okay, now what you have here simply is a map of the Missouri Compromise. Some of you guys looked at this with your projects, but the Missouri Compromise is a way to keep the number of states in the north even with the number of states in the south, right? Why is it so important at this time to keep the states even? What? Balance in the government, right? And particularly what branch of government? The legislature, right? So you want to have the same number of senators in the north and in the south so that nobody gets an advantage, right? If you look at the number of presidents who came from the south right away, it's astronomical. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I think 11 or 12 of the first 16 came from southern states. Wow, that's a lot. And if you expand that out to now, you see that same stranglehold from a sectional standpoint of southern governors to northern governors, right? So this whole idea is going to be framed, at least for a little bit, on sectionalism. Just to recap, the Missouri Compromise now adds Missouri right here, okay, as a slave state. It breaks off Maine from Massachusetts. Then adds Maine as a free state. So now you have 2 more northern senators, 2 more southern senators. And the big piece that it does is it extends this line at 3630 across the west. Now that wasn't American land at this time. It extends it across the west and says anything above this line is going to be a free state, right? And anything below the line is going to be a slave state. Okay? Potential problems now, once we acquire this land, which we'll talk about today, are what? What's that line doing as you move it west? Splitting a bunch of states, right, Andrew? Okay? So you're splitting states or territories, and now somehow you have to decide, okay, are we going to have this line be the southern border or the border for each one of these new states or territories? Or are they going to have to negotiate it somewhere different? Or are they going to have to change how they decide what slavery is? Make sense? Yes, no? Okay. You guys get this? All right. We'll move on. John Quincy Adams. He's the guy in back that looks kind of scary. Somebody did a project on him, thought he was kind of scary. Yeah, a little bit. He has a quote, and this is dealing with and in context of the Missouri Compromise. And John Quincy Adams says, I take it for granted that the present question, meaning how are you going to expand slavery or not, or how are you going to admit states as free states or slave states, is a mere preamble. So it's just the beginning. A title page to a great tragic volume. And you see Thomas Jefferson echo the same sentiments. Okay, they both talk about if we don't solve this idea of free state, slave state, it's going to be a bigger issue later. And again, is it all about slavery and slavery being morally bad? No, it's about money and power, right? Yes, there are abolitionists. We'll talk about them. Yes, there are people who think it's morally wrong, right? But at the end of the day, it's more about preserving that political power or limiting it for someone else. You guys get that? So the idea of expanding slavery out west isn't necessarily opposed by the North because they want to limit slavery because slavery is bad. It's opposed by people in the North because they don't want the South to get a bunch more seats in Congress, right? So then when any laws pass, it's going to favor who? The South. Make sense? Yes, no? Okay. We good with Quincy? Nope. You remember this? Remember this? Good. All right. We'll go back. Well, it'll be online. Okay. You guys remember we looked at the Electoral College stuff? Okay, and we switched around, looked at the election of 1824, where Andrew Jackson had more electoral votes and more popular votes than John Quincy Adams. But he lost the election because nobody had a majority. So if this year's election ends up with no one with a majority, then it's thrown into the House, just like this. Okay? You see a group called Favorite Sons. Okay? And those are people who it's fairly regionalized in 1824, where you have John Quincy Adams with a lot of support in the Northeast, Andrew Jackson with a lot of support in the kind of middle South, and then another candidate we don't need to talk about too much with more support in the deep South. Okay, the election results in John Quincy Adams winning, but not getting as many votes. Almost 50,000 votes less than Andrew Jackson, and fewer electoral votes. Okay, Andrew Jackson, very angry. You guys remember a couple years ago we watched that Andrew Jackson video? And it talked about him, he dueled all the time for his wife's honor and all that stuff. Well, the election in 1824 made Jackson very bitter. And he wins the election in 1828 and institutes really what's a spoils system and kind of what people refer to as Jacksonian democracy. A lot of you guys saw that picture in chapter 5 of Andrew Jackson in like a king's robe, right? And that's basically how he ruled. When we talked Indian removal a couple of years ago, okay? Andrew Jackson wants to remove the Cherokee from Georgia, right? The Cherokee assimilate, they become American, really. They go through the American court system and fight it. A guy named Samuel Worcester, who's a lawyer, argues before the Supreme Court and essentially wins. The Chief Justice says that these tribes are domestic dependent nations, right? And the Chief Justice, John Marshall, basically in the court argued that they should be removed, okay? Andrew Jackson says, well, Chief Justice wrote the law, now let him enforce it. And goes and does what he wanted to do anyway. Right? Total violation of law, Constitution, all that stuff. So it shapes Andrew Jackson for a long time. All right? Now let's take a break.